Well, Tom, since you and I have spent some time in the Soviet Union together, I would like to continue our discussion along that line and to speak a little bit about what's going on in the Soviet Union today. I'm thinking about the economy and really what I think of as a death of a dream in the Soviet Union. We might just talk a little bit about some of our impressions of our encounters with people there. For the most part, we were with the academics and the members of the Institute, and I remember being struck by the leader of the Institute in Moscow, the one that's devoted to world relations and international economy, and just the frank admission on his part of the death of the system as he's known it and the need to move to a more capitalistic approach to a free market system. So I wonder if we could just talk about sort of the mood that we saw among those people.
Well, Jim, I think when we talk about those people, it's worthwhile making some distinctions. For example, when you mention the director of the Institute for World, I forget the...
Well, the acronym is EMEMO.
We'll call it EMEMO. But it's a major institute. It's a major economic think tank in the Soviet Union. And, of course, when we talk about those people, we are talking about people who are committed or have been committed in the past to socialism and to the teachings of Marx and Lenin. And so for them, truly, the reality which has been foisted upon them by the collapse of their economy, or the virtual collapse of their economy, and all that has meant in terms of the political changes going on, that must be a shattering personal experience. To ordinary working people who you and I met and talked to on the streets, I've talked to many of them over the years in my travels there. This is all bewildering and confusing, I would suggest. For the most part, they, like people in our country, get up every day. They face the problem of having to make a living, feed their children. Just coping with the demands of daily living is about all they have space and time for in their system. I think that's true of people everywhere in the world. They're struggling to get along. So for them, this is a time of great fear and insecurity and change. It's threatening to them. It's threatening to their security, to their futures. And I say fear is what and uncertainty is what I found in my discussions with people in that category. Finally,
another thing
I think I might mention just one more is those who are the intelligentsia, the thinkers, the people who are the leaders of the community. I mean, who are not communists, who are not working people, but the intelligentsia. I think they're excited by the prospect of change and but they are small in number. I didn't mean to interrupt you, Jim.
Yeah, well, I was just going to pick up on the point you made about the other thing I saw in the faces of people and what we heard over and over was the notion of fatigue, of just being worn down by this system and all of the problems entailed in it, and the long waiting in lines and the inability to get the consumer goods. Of course, we've heard that over and over now in our own press, and it is something to hear that firsthand, though, and to get a feel for what that means directly. I mean, I can remember somebody telling me about going to somebody's house for dinner, and the great efforts that were made to provide this dinner, and said, just stop and think. The woman in the family would have been working on a very difficult job throughout the day, hard manual labor, and then after her job she'd have to go stand in line for maybe 3 hours to try to purchase the meat for this event, and she would have to pick wisely where she would go and so on. And then the next day perhaps she would go and wait in line for a couple of hours to get the vegetables for the dinner. And by the time she put this on the table, I mean, you're dealing with a woman who has just exerted tremendous energy to be hospitable in this situation. She was feeding a guest American. Well, I mean, that is an amazing thing, and to get sort of a feel for that situation. I think fatigue is a major factor, and then that seems to translate into a lot of upset with Gorbachev and with the policy. I mean, we heard many times that, well, he's been in 5 years, what has he done? You know, we've had all these promises and words, we're going to have a better world, and it's not happening for us. In fact, many would say that they really are worse off. So you get that psychological factor again going, what's it all mean to us? And I'm putting it under this major heading of a death of a dream or of hopes and expectations. And I think that's just sort of the most recent event in a long Soviet history in which dreams have been constantly shattered and that the government political structures have not been responsive to the needs of the people.
I think that's well put. And I think when you talk about the death of a dream, and we bring that concept to bear on the lives of most of the people in the Soviet Union, it seems to me what we're dealing with here is the question of how this leadership is going to find a way to energize these people and to give them hope for the future. I think you're correct. The economy, at least it's my observation, that the economy is becoming noticeably worse. I first traveled there extensively in 1983. I've been back several times since then, and I've noticed a marked deterioration in the standard of what was already a rather meager standard of living by our measurements. During my recent trips there, there's fewer goods available to people. They are standing in line longer in order to buy less and less goods of lower and lower quality. So we could talk about the economics of it, but I think all the signs of imminent economic collapse are there. And the problem that I think we face is that if the average Soviet citizen, who old enough to remember the Brezhnev years, thinks back as to how things were under Brezhnev, he or she will say they were better then than now. In terms of what's available in the stores, how long do I have to wait, how much fatigue am I required to experience day in and day out just to get along. So that compared with, but I think we have to remember, from the point of view of someone like Gorbachev or other leaders who have made the commitment to a market economic system, they, I think, recognize that things are going to have to get, or at least those who are bright enough and understand the workings of economics in the world, recognize that there's going to have to be a deterioration before things can get better. And so the problem is that to turn that economy around, I think they are faced with the problem of facing the need to radically change some of the things that are going on. Now, how they can, and I'm talking particularly about pricing, about getting rid of all those extra rubles and so forth. I don't think we want to turn this into a discussion of economics, but that's what they're faced with. And I think the big question then becomes, what can be done if we're talking about looking at it from their perspective? What can be done in that system?
Tom, that is, no doubt, the practical question where we have to get to. I'd like to lay a little historical context for this, and because I think this question of the spiritual side of it is really important. It is a question of dreams, of hopes, of aspirations, of what makes the human heart tick. And just to look at the recent history of the Soviet Union, I think is very revealing along that line. At the turn of this century, there was a great utopian idealism that took hold in the Soviet Union and in Russia especially, and it was based, I think, on the great difficulties they were experiencing under the Tsar, the hope that something could be changed, and so on. It was fueled in some cases by Marxist thought, but there was this general feeling at the time that at the turn of this century that something better could happen. Philosophers talked about the idea that really that nothing on this earth is impossible. And you had important thinkers who were saying, we're going to have space travel, we're going to get to the moon. There were even people talking about overcoming death. We're going to find scientific ways to, ward death off or bring people back to life. They talked about new modes of consciousness and so on. And the idea of art was going to help transform the world. And so we see this idea of this, what I call this utopian dream. And very often it had to do with God. There was one writer who said, who wanted to change the people from God seekers into God makers. I find that to be a revealing phrase. To change people from God seekers, which indicates there is a deity that we're following and somebody who's got a rule for the world and who's going to be on our side, to God makers, putting it into people's hands. He talked about the almighty, immortal people. And it's out of that I think that Lenin was able to come to power. I mean, I know you've read about Lenin and so on, and maybe you can fill in a minute, but just let me complete this scenario here. But that Lenin, it seems to me, rode that dream, that he was able to capture that utopian spirit and translate it somehow into a new order of things. There's a quote from Leon Trotsky, who was very involved in the revolution, as you recall, with Lenin, and later ran into trouble with Stalin and was finally exiled and then killed and assassinated in Mexico. But Trotsky spoke about this utopian dream. He said we're going to have a new order now. This is in 1925, after the revolution, 1970. He says we're going to have a new order, a new plane. People are going to be raised to a new plane of existence. They're going to be immeasurably stronger, wiser, subtler. Our bodies are going to be more harmonized, our movements more rhythmic, and our voice more musical. In this communist society they were creating, the average human type, he said, will rise to the heights of an Aristotle, a Goethe, or a Marx. Mm-hmm. Now that is a remarkable statement. That is the kind of dream of not just a better world transforming society. We're going to transform human nature. Mm-hmm. I saw recently on television people interviewed who were talking about the 20s under Stalin, peasants on the farms working hard, and they had this conviction they were going to make a new world. Things were going to be different. It's that kind of dream, I think, that fueled the communist ideal, that fueled the popularity of Marxism throughout much of our century, and it's that very dream, I think, that really has died in the minds of the intellectuals in the Soviet Union today.
Well, it may have, I think it's true that it has died but the death has been forced upon them by reality. And I think what you've just described is the history of a people who were captured by those who believed in the infinite power of man to define human nature. And when you leave the dimension that they left out, namely the spiritual dimension, the dimension of man as created by God, and having a dimension to him, the spiritual dimension. When you make that mistake, when you make that error, what you end up with is the kind of system they made up with, by ignoring human nature, by ignoring the craving in the heart for something greater than just what man can do. In other words, the craving for the infinite that's in us, this infinite lust for something that can never be satisfied, this inchoate passion of the human heart for something beyond the works of man. And but in doing so, those among the Bolsheviks who believed in that utopian dream, they cut themselves off from some of the most powerful creative forces in the history and culture of ancient Russia, particularly as reflected in the art and the literature that you and I saw when we were traveling there, in the frescoes, the paintings on the walls of the churches. And I remember our delegation lost you once because I think you ended up so engrossed in one of the frescoes inside the Kremlin, in one of the churches inside the Kremlin, that you were standing there gazing at the fresco on the ceiling of one of the churches. We left, and all of a sudden we realized that we had lost you.
Yes, I went into a bit of ecstasy there.
Yes,
it was actually a particular icon that had captured me, and I was afraid that I had lost the delegation forever and was imprisoned in the Kremlin. But it's that spiritual dimension. Tom, let's talk about Lenin just a minute here. Lenin is one, I think that his idea was to get power, and that was Stalin's idea too. It was to accumulate power. It wasn't always clear what you were going to do with that, and it seems to me there was a fundamental moral problem in this approach that they took, and that is that there was no longer any recourse to a higher power to judge the morality of the people. Really, the morality resided in the party, in the upper echelons of the party, and finally in the chairman of the party. And therefore, that person became just almost a god, an idol kind of figure. And it's commonly said, as we heard over and over, that Stalin is the bad guy, that he's the villain. He collectivized the farms and repressed the people and killed millions and had all of the purges, but that he, had gone against what Lenin wanted. But there's another viewpoint on that, and that is that the seeds of Stalin are contained in Lenin's thought. As soon as Lenin made the party chief to be the top figure and the repository of moral wisdom, then you just set the stage for someone like Stalin to appear and to take over and to have that ruthless dictatorship. I believe that we will see in the Soviet Union in the near future greater criticisms of Lenin himself. It's currently fashionable to criticize Stalin, but not Lenin. But I think we heard rumblings of something else that says that the next figure to be criticized will be Lenin, and that Lenin really did have it wrong in the very beginning, and that is what has damaged the party all the way along the line. Although I must say, on Lenin's behalf, he did fear Stalin, and remember the famous statement he made in his testament before he died, warning them and telling them to get rid of Stalin as the general secretary of the party. And that actually became a great fight after Lenin's death, and that particular testament was read to a small group of people, but they chose to ignore it and to keep Stalin in power. But Lenin, to his credit, did see that Stalin was unstable and not fit to assume power in the Soviet Union.
I think you're right. I think you just put your finger on the fundamental difference between Western and Russian legal and philosophical traditions. I misstated that, between Soviet and Western legal traditions, and because of this commitment to science as the ultimate arbiter of what is good and bad, what they ended up with, as you've pointed out, is a statist philosophy of government. That is, there was in their system, that is in the Soviet legal tradition, there is no higher seat of authority than the state itself. The problem is that, as you suggest, that ultimately sets up a situation in which those who hold the reins of power within the state have no check on their ability to exercise that power. In other words, there is no higher standard of morality other than the state itself. And so those who hold the power of the state, that is the power to order out the police, the power to put people in prison, the power to deprive humans of their rights and so forth, you have set up the ingredients for the seizure of absolute power particularly by a person who lusts for power. And I think you're right that in time historians will come to see Lenin's thinking as one of the main reasons how this system in which absolute power was eventually seized by Stalin, millions and millions of people were sent to their deaths, and it is that terrible reality, I think, that this kind of system can create those kind of risks to the people, that as absolute power can be taken over, that has come to be recognized by many of the intellectuals. In our system, the difference in our system is that when we say the rule of law, that presupposes that there is a source of authority above any one human being. And in our system, our president, our legislature, our judges, all are subordinate to the law. And we embody that in our country in a written constitution. And so the very basic notion in our system is that the human being is the ultimate sovereign. We human beings are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights from which all other rights and powers of individuals and of those who exercise power in the state spring. And so we then give to those who have power, we, the people, consent to be governed. But those who govern must recognize our fundamental human rights, God-given rights, which precede the state. And so that is the ultimate core idea behind the notion that we are a nation which governs ourselves by the rule of law.
We're under law. And
Under
of
law.
course what happens when you have a moral vacuum like that, people will come in, and Stalin was the terrible perpetrator of all of that. He was an extremely clever man, but what he did was make a god out of Lenin. He knew that Lenin didn't like him, and that Lenin didn't want him to take over, and yet he turned it all around, made a god out of Lenin. You know, Stalin was a seminarian at one time, and he seemed to have a real feel for the religious element. It's almost as though he created a new religion, you know, by embalming Lenin and setting up the tomb in Red Square and all of the formalism and ritual connected with all of that. And it became a way of controlling everything. And then, of course, the terrible secret police and the arrests and then the purges within the party, even his close friends and so on. But it is that whenever you have a moral vacuum, something will become an absolute. I think historically you can see that. Psychologically it makes sense. When you have a moral vacuum, something will become an absolute. Something will take over. And Stalin made Lenin that god, made a religion out of the whole Soviet system, and set him up as sort of the vicar on earth of this godlike figure. And he carried on. And I think that gave a lot of it its power. Of course, a lot of people did support Stalin, didn't they, during that time? Even though there was a lot of repression, he did have a good deal of popular support and often put himself forward as the person who would really be on the side of the people.
Well, I think we have to recognize that by electrifying, that is, by throwing all the resources of the state behind the industrialization of Russia, Stalin, during that period, when people everywhere, the peasants and workers everywhere, were living in intolerable, unthinkably bad conditions, that by throwing all the power of the state and all the resources of the state behind the industrialization of the Soviet Union, the standard of living of some people was improved. And so there were people who then saw Stalin as a strong leader who was making some necessary changes in the economy of that system. But please, coming back to your idea of Lenin becoming in the hands of a clever what's the word I'm thinking of? The megalomaniacal person like Stalin, in the hands of Stalin's a very clever man, because yes, he did make Lenin the secular saint of the Soviet Union, thereby, I think, as you pointed out, recognizing the need for an absolute in the hearts of people. But keep in mind that when he really needed the Church, the Russian Orthodox Church, as the Germans were marching on Moscow, he went to Lenin's mausoleum and stood shoulder to shoulder with the patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church, and opened his arms to the Russian Orthodox Church. And many historians believe that it was that gesture to the Russian Orthodox Church in time of great crisis which gave to Stalin the moral authority to lead the nation against the Nazis, against Hitler.
They were also very influential in raising money for the war effort.
Raising money for the war effort.
So it was very practical as well as symbolic.
So he co-opted the Russian Orthodox Church with all of its rich traditions, with all of its spirituality and so forth, as a means of rallying the people behind the war effort, and, as you say, raising money and getting the people to make the sacrifices for Mother Russia that were necessary to fend off the attack from Hitler.
Tom, you know, what I was thinking, what we heard from the memo people, again, an acronym for the think tank that we dealt with while we were in the Soviet Union, was the idea of the need to return to private property, which, of course, was in their legislature and passed and is becoming a reality gradually. But what Stalin did, of course, was to collectivize the farms, and thereby destroying their agricultural system by and large. And what we heard from the economists was, of course, we must move to private property. Of course, this whole thing isn't going to work unless there are some incentives for people to produce more. And I think that is, again, a remarkable kind of statement. It's a death, not of Leninism, really, because he was more open to that, but clearly of Stalin's collectivization theory and practice, which was so brutal and so destructive of their economy.
It's interesting because now they're having trouble. Now they've passed laws which say to the peasants, you now can own your own farms. they're having trouble getting the peasants to accept that idea because the peasants, of course, don't want to take the risks.
Right. It's terrible. I talked to one deputy of the Supreme Soviet from Siberia who spent all of lunch one day asking my advice about how he could educate his people to try to take greater initiative and to move with the new system. He saw himself now as a major teacher. That was his function, to get people. But after you've put people in a slavery condition and systematically repress their initiative and creativity, it is so hard to bring it back. And that's one of the great problems they face, isn't it?
Yeah, it sure is, because, in their Constitution, what they say is every person shall be guaranteed certain economic rights. The right to a place to live, the right to medical treatment, the right to an education, the right to a subsidized retirement. So what they did was, in effect, by the support of the people, by giving them these economic guarantees, in return for the surrender by the people of the right, yes, to own property, the right to do other things, but the right also to go out and try and fail. And that's the thing that's probably the most difficult task they face, is educating their people as to what is really meant by what we refer to as a market economy. Because a market economy means freedom to go out and use your talents and to take risks and to succeed or fail. And it's the or fail that they have to somehow come to grips with.
Tom, can I use your last remarks as a way of trying to get back to the practical point where you were at the beginning of saying, what are they going to do? And we know it's massive and difficult. But one of the things they do need to do is change the mentality. They have to, as you suggested, come up with a new dream, a new hope, and a revitalization of the human spirit, so that they're going to be able to move forward and foster this creativity and this initiative and entrepreneurship. I suppose one of the signs of hope that we found there was to meet people who were thinking in that way, looking for joint business ventures with American people and so on. So I guess our answer to this problem that you've posed really is they must find a new mentality, some new dream and hope that's going to gear them up and help them to function really more effectively and to make it in the world economy.